On the morning of August 13th, 2018, a man stood on his front porch in Frederick, Colorado, and lied to the entire world. He was calm, almost too calm. His voice was steady, his eyes dry, and his words were carefully chosen as a local news camera captured every second. He told reporters his pregnant wife had come home in the early hours of the morning, that they had argued, and that when he left for work she was alive. He said he had no idea where she was. He said he was desperate to find her. He said he just wanted his family back. What Christopher Watts did not say, what he could not say, was that his wife Shanann was already dead, that his two little girls, 4-year-old Bella and 3-year-old Celeste, were already dead, that he had driven their bodies to the oil field where he worked and buried Shanann in a shallow grave while stuffing his daughters into crude oil tanks, that the baby boy Shanann was carrying, a son they had already named Nico, never had a single chance. That image of Chris Watts standing on his porch, composed and rehearsed, while his family lay buried at his worksite, became one of the most chilling moments in American true crime history. And the story behind it, the secrets, the lies, the manipulation, and the devastating loss broke the hearts of millions of people around the world who had watched Shanann Watts live her life out loud, never knowing how it would end. This is her story. Shanann Watts was born on January 10th, 1984 in Aberdeen, North Carolina. From the very beginning, she was the kind of person who filled up every room she walked into. She was loud in the best way, warm, funny, relentlessly positive, and deeply devoted to the people she loved. Growing up, she was close to her family, fiercely loyal to her friends, and the type of person who remembered everyone's birthday, who showed up when things got hard, and who never let the people she loved feel invisible. She was not handed an easy life. As a young woman, Shanann was diagnosed with lupus, an autoimmune disease that caused her significant physical pain and required ongoing medical management. She also faced financial hardships that would have broken a lesser spirit. But Shanann's response to difficulty was never to retreat. It was to push harder. She turned every obstacle into motivation and found ways to build a life that looked exactly like the one she had always dreamed of. She was a mother in the most profound sense of the word. When her daughters Bella and Celeste came into the world, Shanann documented everything. She filmed their morning routines, their tantrums, their laughter, their milestones. She shared it all on social media with a transparency that felt radical at the time. A real mother showing the real chaos and the real joy of raising small children. Bella, the older one, was perceptive and articulate beyond her years. Celeste was wild and funny and magnetic. Shanann loved them with everything she had, and anyone who watched even 5 minutes of her videos could see it. She also built a business. Shanann worked as an independent distributor for Thrive, a wellness and supplement company, and she threw herself into it with the same intensity she brought to everything else. She documented her work online, shared her health journey, and built a following of people who genuinely connected with her authenticity. She was not performing a perfect life. She was sharing a real one, with all its messiness and beauty intact. Then there was Chris. Christopher Lee Watts was born on May 16th, 1985 in Spring Lake, North Carolina. He was quiet where Shanann was loud, reserved where she was expressive, and understated in a way that many people who knew him described as calm and reliable. He and Shanann met in 2010 and were married in 2012. To the outside world, they appeared to be a complementary match, her fire balanced by his steadiness. They built a life together in Colorado, bought a house in a quiet subdivision in Frederick, and had 2 daughters who, by every visible measure, were thriving. What the outside world did not see was the growing distance that had been quietly widening between them for years. The financial pressure was enormous. They were living beyond their means, carrying significant debt, and struggling in ways they kept carefully hidden from the social media version of their lives. Shanann's business was doing well, but the cost of their lifestyle, the house, the cars, the girls' activities, were mounting in ways that created real tension. And then there was the emotional distance. Chris Watts, those who knew him said, had always been difficult to truly reach. He was not someone who talked about his feelings or engaged openly in conflict. He internalized everything, and as the marriage frayed, he did not reach toward Shanann. He pulled further away into a private world she could not access. By the summer of 2018, Shanann had started to feel it. She talked to friends about the shift in Chris, about the way he seemed disconnected and cold, about how his behavior had changed in ways she could not fully explain. She was 15 weeks pregnant with Nico when she flew to North Carolina for a 5-week work trip with Bella and Celeste, partly for business, partly, friends later said, to give the marriage some space and see if distance might bring them closer together. It did not. While Shanann was in North Carolina, Chris Watts was in Colorado. And he was not alone. He had begun an affair with a coworker named Nico Kessinger. It was intense and consuming. He told Nico things he had never told Shanann, or perhaps things he had convinced himself were true, about wanting a different life, about feeling trapped, about being ready to start over. By the time Shanann boarded her flight back to Colorado on the night of August 12th, 2018, Chris Watts had already decided in some dark and irreversible part of himself that his marriage was over. What he had also decided, though this is the part that defies every human impulse to understand, was that ending the marriage was not enough. Shanann landed in Denver at approximately 1:48 in the morning on August 13th. A neighbor's security camera captured her arriving home, pulling her suitcase up the driveway and entering the house. Bella and Celeste were asleep. Chris was awake. What happened in the hours that followed in that quiet house in Frederick, Colorado, is almost impossible to sit with. Chris Watts strangled his wife in their bed while their daughters slept nearby. Shanann was 15 weeks pregnant. Nico, the son they had announced with joy, the baby whose name had already been chosen, died with her. Then, in an act of violence so incomprehensible that criminal psychologists have spent years trying to explain it, Chris Watts went to his daughter's rooms and killed Bella and Celeste too. He then loaded his family's bodies into his work truck and drove to the Anadarko oil field where he was employed. He buried Shanann in a shallow grave near the site. He placed Bella and Celeste inside oil storage tanks. Then he drove home, showered, and went back to work. If you are watching this and you have never heard this story before, take a moment, because the weight of what just happened in those last few sentences is almost too heavy to process. A father, a husband, 4 lives, including an unborn child, gone before sunrise, and then he stood on his porch and talked to the cameras. If this story is already affecting you, and we know it is, hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss a story this powerful. This channel exists to give these victims a voice. Be part of that. Shanann's closest friend, Nicole Atkinson, had been with her on the North Carolina trip and had driven her to the airport the night before. She knew Shanann's schedule intimately, and when Shanann missed a doctor's appointment that morning and stopped responding to texts and calls, Nicole did not wait. She drove to the house. She rang the doorbell. She called Chris. She called the police. When officers arrived for the welfare check, Chris Watts met them at the door. What they encountered was a man who behaved in a way that veteran law enforcement officers later described as deeply unsettling, not because he was visibly agitated or distressed, but because of the opposite. He was cooperative. He was articulate. He walked officers through the house and answered their questions without visible emotion. He told them Shanann had taken the girls somewhere. He had no idea where. He was worried. The officers noted his demeanor. They noted that the girls' shoes were still by the door, that Shanann's car was still in the garage, that nothing in the house suggested a woman had packed up her children and left voluntarily in the middle of the night. They also noted that Chris Watts did not cry. Law enforcement moved fast. Within hours, investigators were pulling phone records, GPS data from Chris's work truck, and footage from neighboring security cameras. What they found demolished his story piece by piece. His truck's GPS showed a route to the Anadarko oil field on the morning of August 13th, the morning he claimed to have left for work as normal. Cell phone data placed him exactly where investigators suspected. And when detectives began looking into his personal life, The affair with Nickel Kessinger surfaced almost immediately. The interrogation that followed was a master class in investigative technique. FBI agent Graham Coder sat across from Chris Watts and methodically, quietly, took apart every lie he had constructed. At one point, investigators told Chris they had obtained surveillance footage from the oil field, and they watched his composure finally begin to fracture. On August 15, 2018, just 2 days after Shanann was reported missing, Christopher Watts was arrested and charged with the murders of his wife and daughters. The discovery of the bodies at the oil field confirmed what investigators had already come to believe. The world, which had been watching and hoping, went into collective mourning. The grief was not abstract. Millions of people had watched Shanann's videos. They had seen Bella and Celeste eating breakfast, playing dress-up, fighting over toys the way small children do. They had seen Shanann announce her pregnancy, visibly glowing, talking about baby Nico with the kind of excitement that is impossible to fake. These were not strangers. They were a family people had let into their lives through a screen, and the loss of them felt personal in a way that was difficult to articulate. Shanann's parents, Frank and Sandra Ruchek, released a statement that contained a line so raw and so human that it stopped people cold. They said they had lost not one daughter, but an entire family, and that the man responsible had sat at their table and broken bread with them. Now let's pause here, because the question that every person watching this is asking, the question investigators, psychologists, and journalists have been asking since the moment Chris Watts was arrested is why. Not why in the abstract sense, but why in the specific, clinical, psychological sense. What kind of person does this? Christopher Watts has been studied extensively by forensic psychologists since his arrest, and what has emerged is a portrait of a man driven by a profound inability to tolerate discomfort. Not a monster in the Hollywood sense, not visibly volatile or threatening, but someone who had constructed an entire identity around the appearance of a good life without ever genuinely inhabiting it. When that life became inconvenient, when the affair made him want something different, when the pregnancy made escape feel impossible, when the mortgage and the debt and the expectations closed in, he did not have the psychological architecture to navigate any of it honestly. Experts describe this profile as a family annihilator, a specific and deeply disturbing subset of domestic homicide in which a partner or parent kills the entire family unit rather than face separation, exposure, or loss of control. It is not impulsive. It is not the result of a single moment of rage. It is calculated, and it is almost always preceded by a long period of emotional detachment in which the perpetrator has already, in their own mind, separated themselves from the people they are about to destroy. Chris Watts had checked out of his family long before August 13th. What remained was a man going through motions, filming videos, attending barbecues, posing for family photos, while internally he had already decided that Shanann and the girls were an obstacle rather than a life. The cowardice of that is staggering. Initially, when confronted with the evidence, Chris Watts did something that shocked even seasoned investigators. He admitted to killing Shanann, but he tried to blame her death on a rage response after he claimed he had watched her strangle Bella and Celeste. It was a lie so grotesque, so calculated to shift blame onto a woman who could no longer speak for herself, that it drew immediate and furious condemnation. No evidence supported his claim. The forensic evidence told a completely different story. He eventually pleaded guilty to all 5 counts of first-degree murder. Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and the charges related to Nico's death, as well as additional counts, including unlawful termination of a pregnancy. Because he pleaded guilty, he was spared the death penalty and sentenced to 5 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He will die in prison. In the courtroom, Shanann's father, Frank Ruchek, stood and delivered a victim impact statement that silenced the room. He spoke about his daughter. He spoke about Bella and Celeste. He spoke about Nico, the grandson he never got to hold. And he spoke directly to Chris Watts with a grief and a fury that no words in this script can adequately capture. Shanann's brother Frankie stood too, and the weight of their words, the specific, irreplaceable loss of 4 people who deserved to live, filled that courtroom with something that felt like a physical force. In 2019, while serving his sentence at the Dodge Correctional Institution in Wisconsin, Chris Watts sat down for a series of interviews with investigators in what became known as the Rzucek family's formal request for the full truth. In those sessions, Chris provided a detailed account of what happened the night of August 12th, eking into the early morning of August 13th. The details that emerged were devastating. He described the sequence of events with a flatness that investigators found profoundly disturbing, not because he showed no remorse, but because the remorse, when it came, felt fundamentally disconnected from the magnitude of what he had done. He also, in those interviews, attempted repeatedly to center the narrative on his affair with Nicole Kessinger, suggesting she had influenced him, that her desire for a clean break had shaped his thinking. Nicole Kessinger, who cooperated fully with investigators from the very beginning and who has maintained she had no knowledge of his intentions, categorically denied any such influence. Investigators found nothing to contradict her account. Chris Watts destroyed his family so he could be free, and what he got instead was a concrete cell, and 5 life sentences, and a name that will forever be associated with one of the most devastating betrayals a family has ever suffered. Shanann Watts deserved to watch her daughters grow up. She deserved to hold Nico. She deserved to build the life she was working so hard to create. The business, the house, the family, the future she talked about with such specific and radiant hope. Bella deserved to become the perceptive, articulate young woman she was already becoming at 4 years old. Celeste deserved to run and laugh and be wild for decades more. Nico deserved to be born. Before we continue honoring Shanann's memory, if this story is moving you, if you feel the weight of what these women and children deserved, please like this video right now. It takes 1 second, and it helps make sure stories like Shanann's reach people who need to hear them. Every like is a small act of saying her name matters. The legacy Shanann left behind is complicated in the way that legacies often are when a life is cut short by violence. Her social media presence, those thousands of videos, those morning routines, those moments with Bella and Celeste, became both a memorial and a source of ongoing grief for the millions of people who had followed her. Her family has worked to ensure that she is remembered as she lived, as a mother, a fighter, a woman of enormous energy and heart, not simply as a victim. Father Frank Rzucek co-wrote a book about the case. Advocacy organizations have used Shanann's story to raise awareness about the warning signs of family annihilators and the specific danger period that exists when a partner is seeking to leave or has become an obstacle to a new life. Her case has been studied in criminal psychology courses and cited in domestic violence research as a defining example of how danger can live behind the most ordinary-looking front doors. Shanann's story also forced a necessary and painful conversation about the gap between the lives people present online and what is actually happening behind closed doors. Not because Shanann was hiding abuse, she was not, at least not in the ways we typically recognize, but because the image of the perfect family can be so powerful, so carefully maintained, that even the person living inside it can fail to see the full danger until it is far too late. There is something Shanann said in one of her last videos, filmed in North Carolina, just days before she flew home, that people who loved her have returned to again and again. She was talking about her marriage, about the work she and Chris were doing to reconnect, about how committed she was to making things work. She said she was not a quitter. She said she believed in her family. She meant every word. And she deserved a partner who meant them too. Rest in peace, Shanann. Rest in peace, Bella. Rest in peace, Celeste. Rest in peace, Nico. The world did not protect you the way it should have, but it has not forgotten you, and it never will. If this story stayed with you, if it made you feel something, if it reminded you that behind every headline is a real human life that deserved so much more, please share this video. Share it for Shanann. Share it for Bella and Celeste. Share it for every person who has ever loved someone who turned out to be their greatest danger. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Leave a comment below telling us what part of this story hit you hardest and come back for the next story. Because there are more voices out there that deserve to be heard. If you or someone you know is in a relationship that feels unsafe, please reach out to the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-79-97233 or visit thehotline.org. You are not alone. Help is there. Say her name, Shanann Watts.